In this video, we're going to discuss the folder watch object. The folder watch object is capable of watching a particular folder on the BlueSky Integration Studio server and then processing all of the files that it finds in that particular folder. When it finds a file to process, it passes it along to another BIS job to load that file. And then it loops back around and it can look for another file to process in that same folder. The way that it passes the file name to the job that actually loads the file is through a BIS parameter. So in this case, we created a job and it has a parameter called file name. And when the folder watch object finds a file in the folder to process, it sets the parameter of file name to the path and file name that it finds and then calls this job, which loads the file and then it loops back around. So that's basically how the whole process works. What I did was set up a couple of folders out here. And I have a folder called the inbound, and I put 4 files in there. They're all the same format, but I want to build a job that is capable of watching this inbound folder and then looking for files to process and process all 4 of these files. And then I wanted to move these files as it processes them down to this folder, which is my archive folder, so that I can see, exactly what was processed. The files get archived. They don't get reprocessed because they're dropping out of the inbound folder. And then I also want to stick a date and time stamp on them so that I know when they were processed. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is come over here and create a brand new sequence job. You'll notice that the folder watch object is under the job sequence group. That means that these objects can only be used in a job sequence. So I'm going to pull a folder watch object over and a loop object, because these two objects work hand in hand together, because as it finds files, and then it's going to loop around and it's going to look for another file to process. So these two objects have to work together. And then the job that actually loads the file that it finds is going to be our load transactions job that we had set up previously in another video. If you remember, in that video we set up this text file object, and we created a parameter called file name, and we did that at the job level. If I click on the white space anywhere at the job level here, I created a job level parameter called file name. And then I process that file, and then I use that parameter as the file name that I want to process for my text object. And that allows me to pass a file name in via a parameter. So I'm not hard coding a path and file name for this particular job. I can pass it in via the parameter. So we're going to take advantage of that in the folder watch, because the folder watch is capable of passing a path and file name that it finds through a parameter to a job. So we're going to pull over a run job object here, and then we're going to connect these guys up. Okay, and then I'm just going to kind of clean this up a little bit. I'll just call this inbound, and we'll call this loop around. Okay, so now what I need to do is I need to set this job up. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and save this job, and I'm going to call it sequence folder watch sample. And I'm going to point this run job object to my load transactions job. Okay. And there's our parameter that it recognizes. It says, oh, okay, you have a parameter called file name. I'm going to go ahead and pull that in. All right. So now that we have our job set up, we can come over here to our folder watch and we can start setting this up. So you'll notice some of the properties in here are, how many seconds to check for. Do I want to date stamp archives? What's the folder I want to watch? Things like that. So we'll just kind of walk through some of these properties here and set them up individually. So the first property I want to set up is, what folder do I want to watch? What folder do I want to point to here? And that's going to be my inbound folder. So I created a folder on my C drive and my BIS, and I created a folder called inbound, and I just threw 4 files out there. So this is going to be the folder that I want to watch. So I'm going to point this over here and point that to my inbound folder. And then where do I want the processed files to go after they're processed? And that's going to be my archive folder. So if you remember, I also created a folder under that BIS folder called archive. So once the file gets processed from the inbound folder here, it'll be moved down to the archive folder here. So I'm going to go ahead and select my archive folder here. Okay, and a couple other properties that are interesting are check every X number of seconds. So what this does is, after it finds a file to process, and then it runs the job to load the file that it finds, it comes down here to the loop object, and it's going to say, I'm going to wait a few seconds before I go look for another file. So the reason that you want to do that is because, it all depends on how many files you're getting and how often you get them. What's the velocity of the files that are going to fall into that folder? If you're getting a lot of files all the time, then you want to move this way down, because you don't want to wait, a whole bunch of time in between, the processing of each file. There's no sense in waiting around. But you also, don't want this thing, if you don't have a lot of files coming in, you don't want this thing spinning, just constantly looking for a file when you only get a file once an hour, for instance, because that'll just take up CPU and memory, and why do that? Okay, so in our case, we know we have 4 files out there to process. So I'm going to just kind of wait around 2 seconds here, before I jump around and process the next file. And then another interesting property is how do I want it to loop? Do I want it to loop until a file is found? I can loop until the folder is completely empty, or I can do a manual stop. Okay, so let's talk about these for a minute. So file found is when it's going to watch a particular folder, and when it finds a file, any file, it's going to process it, and it's going to call this job and process it and run, and then this job's going to quit. So it's only going to process one of the 3 files that it finds, because we said here in the property, we only want you to process when a file is found. So I want you to watch this folder. It could sit there and watch it all day long, and when a file pops in there, I want you to process it, but then I want you to quit. The other option is folder is empty. Folder is empty means that it'll continue to loop forever until it runs out of files to process. So in our case, we have 4 files out there. It would process the first one, the second, the third, the fourth, and then it would fall out and be done. And finally, the last option is manual stop. So manual stop means I want you to loop forever until I tell you to stop. And how do I do that? How do I tell you to stop? So under the loop around object over here, there's some code here that you can write to tell it when you want it to stop. The default is true. Okay, when you want it to stop, you'll return a false. So you can write anything you want. Maybe you want to kick this job off at 7 o'clock in the morning, but then you want it, at 8 o'clock at night, you want this thing to, basically stop looping, whether there's files to process or not. So you can say, if now.time of day.hour, or actually we can do now.hour is greater than 8, then return false. Else, return true. So basically we're saying, something like, I want you to run all day long and loop around and look for files, but if it's after 8 o'clock, stop. I don't want you to do it anymore. Okay? So you can do that kind of stuff too. Or you can loop all week long, and then maybe you could say if it's Saturday, stop looping. So maybe you don't want to loop on the weekends, and then Monday morning you'd kick it back off with a scheduled process. Okay, so we want to do, for our particular sample, we want to do loop until the folder is empty. Because I know that I have 4 files out there, and I want to loop around and process all 4 of those files. So the parameter to map the file path to. So if we go back to our PowerPoint here, is when it finds a file to process, how does it pass the path and file name over to this job, so that this job knows what to process? And that's going to be the file name parameter. We happen to name it file name for our job, but you can name that anything you want. So if I click on this here, it's going to see the file name parameter because that's the parameter that was pulled in when I set this job up. Okay, and this job has a file name parameter. So basically, I'm telling the folder watch, here's the parameter that I want you to pass that path and file name through to this job, so that it knows, exactly which file to process. Okay. So the other thing we can do is set a wildcard. So if you notice in my inbound directory here, all the files that I'm getting are CSV files. So I can put a business rule on here that says I only want you to look for .csv files. I don't think that's case sensitive. Okay. So just in case, that's kind of a safety thing. Is what if a text file falls in there, or a bitmap, or a GIF, or some file that obviously should not be processed. I can have the folder watch ignore all files except CSV files. And then finally, I can say the date stamped archive files. So what this is after I process a file, it will take that file name and append on the date and time stamp to the file name before it moves it into the archive folder. And that way I know exactly when that file was archived and when it was processed in BlueSky Integration Studio. Okay, so that's basically it. I mean, we set up the folder watch object, and it's as simple as pointing it to my folders where I want to watch and where I want the files moved to, pointing it to the parameter so that it knows how to pass the path and file name to this job. And then if I want, I can play around with the check every X number of seconds. I can put a wildcard on there, and then my business rule of how often do I want you to loop, or what's the rule as far as how to loop. So I'm going to go ahead and compile this job. And then I'm going to go over here to job control, and I'm going to kick it off. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here and pop these up after it runs. And what we're going to see here is that it's going to run the load transaction job 4 times, 1 for each of these files. And as it processes these files, I want to see them fall down here into the archive folder. So I'm going to go ahead and run my job. Okay, so the load transactions job is running. You'll notice none of the files have been moved yet because it's processing the first one. And then the first file just got processed and it was moved down here to the archive folder. And then it kicked off the second process. So the second file should be loaded now. And then finally, it's going to kick off again here. It's going to process the third file. And then finally, it's working on the fourth file here. And there it goes. Okay, so once the fourth file gets done here, we should see that the folder watch will stop running because we set it up to be process until, or loop until the folder is empty. So now that the folder is empty, it thinks it's done. It says, okay, well, I did that. I went out and I looked and I processed all the files and the folder's empty now, so I'm done. And the other thing that you'll notice is that as it took those files and moved it down here to the archive, it put that date timestamp on the file for us. So I can see exactly when that file was processed down to the second. Okay, and that's how you process, or that's how you use the folder watch object in BlueSky Integration Studio.